So last season, when we did the episode on attachment, I talked about the second marathon that I ran where you may remember where it all fell apart and I got injured halfway through, but managed to power on through to the end because I changed my personal narrative from about getting my personal best to about overcoming adversity and injury to get over the line. So today, as we're talking about suffering, I'm going to talk about my first marathon. And I realized as I was preparing this that I'm probably not inspiring many people to take up running a marathon with my injuries and this one being suffering. But I really do encourage people to do it. It's what I love about running is it really pushes you to extremes of endurance and physical experience and can teach you lessons in a lot clearer way than normal experience because it's kind of this heightened experience. So it was 2013 when I ran this marathon, and it was only a year after I'd started running where I couldn't run for literally more than 5 minutes. But I'd put in the work and I'd run about 700 kilometers that year. So I was in pretty good shape. But the immediate preparation for the race wasn't ideal because I spent a week partying at Burning Man 2 weeks before. So yeah, and fell off my bike right on the last day of Burning Man, so I was also injured. But my main issue was on the day itself when I decided that I would preemptively protect myself against this small blister I had on the side of my the ball of my right foot by putting one of these blister patches on it, and the idea was that I would protect it. But after about 5 kilometers into the race, I realized what a huge mistake I'd made, because rather than protecting this blister, this patch had caused what it felt like it was causing a much bigger blood blister. And but with only 5 kilometers down and there were 37 more kilometers to go, I knew I wouldn't be able to last the distance if I dwelt on this too much. And it was at this point that I remembered a quote I read in a book about running by the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. And this quote's been attributed to lots of different people, and it's unsure where it came from. But the quote is, "Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional." And this idea made such a big difference to me because before I came across this quote, I guess I thought that pain and suffering were pretty much synonymous, but they're really not. And for me, during the race, I was able to separate the physical aspect of pain from the more psychological or emotional aspect of suffering. And if I looked at the pain element, I could assess it on its own. And yeah, it hurt because there was this stinging feeling in my foot literally every time I landed. But it was a kind of reasonably stable pain. It wasn't increasing and it wasn't becoming overwhelming. And knowing that suffering was optional, I was able to drop all my other thoughts. So my suffering thoughts would be along the lines of, I can't believe I've got to run like this for another 3 hours. Why me? I can't believe I've trained so much to be undone by this stupid mistake. But whenever I found myself dwelling on these suffering kinds of thoughts, I could bring myself back. And it's like in meditation, when we find ourselves lost in thought, we bring ourselves back to the mantra, but obviously we don't use the mantra during eyes open day-to-day life. So instead I would bring myself back to my senses. So I would feel the sensations in my body and listen to the shouts from the crowd, and look at my fellow competitors to kind of be inspired by their heroic efforts. And in fact, whenever I'm flagging in a race, one of my favorite things to do is there's always kids on the side of the course, and I love to go up and high five them because they're always putting their hands out. And they smile and you smile and everything's great. So I got through the race and managed to get almost the time I was aiming for, but then it came the time to take my shoe off. It wasn't pretty, and I went to the St. John's ambulance who were there, and the woman actually said it was the biggest blood blister she'd ever seen. And this, this is a professional medic. But yeah, so I knew if I dwelt on the suffering part of it, I wouldn't have been able to finish. I would have used it as an excuse. But when I separated it out and just had the pain on its own, it was much more manageable. And then I was thinking about how outside of running, after I learned to meditate, I found I suffered a lot less in general, whether it was not suffering through, speculating about things that might or might not happen in the future, or suffering by feeling guilty about things I'd said or done. And then I was thinking about how much of the amount of suffering in my life has been self-inflicted, specifically with hangovers. We've talked about this before, but if you ask someone who has a hangover, how are you doing? They might say, I'm really suffering. And it's that kind of, that aspect of it. And for me, hangovers often weren't about physical stuff. Like, I'm rarely sick on a hangover, like physically sick, but it would be this mental and emotional suffering. So kind of to sum up, like in very general terms, what meditation has done for suffering is that similar aspect to how it did in the running, where it takes you out of this suffering, which is a mental process, and brings you back to reality. And reality in the present moment, there's hardly ever anything wrong right now. It's only when you project it. So projecting, what could happen if I look in my shoe, or what could, these possibilities, it's not actually what's happening now.